heard arguments today over laws in Florida and here in Texas aimed at imposing restrictions on social media companies' ability to moderate content on their sites. A ruling in this case could transform the internet as we know it. And according to the New York Times, the court's decision could fundamentally alter the nature of speech on the internet. Joining us now is New York Times reporter who has been covering this case, David McCabe. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get to today's hearing, can you just provide a little background on the laws in Florida and Texas, which some say really stem from an effort to shield conservative voices on various platforms?
Yeah, in 2021, shortly after a number of platforms banned former President Donald Trump, legislators in Texas and in Florida passed these laws. And they're a little different, but they do ultimately similar things. So the Texas law makes it illegal for the platforms to take down posts based on the viewpoint. Florida law would fine platforms that ban a candidate for office in the state. So effectively, both are aimed at keeping the platforms from taking down political speech.
Can you walk us through what you heard in court today?
Yeah, so the TechCom groups representing the tech companies, a group that represents companies like Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, represents Google, have brought lawsuits challenging these laws. And they say that basically these laws are a violation of their First Amendment rights to moderate their platforms as they see fit. And I think what we heard in court today was the Supreme Court justices, who obviously have different views on contentious issues, really grappling with how do these internet platforms fit into the legal paradigms that have been established to deal with communications over a century or more. And so they seemed somewhat skeptical of the constitutionality of the laws, but they were also sort of thinking of how can these platforms fit into our understanding of a world that used to be defined by technology like a telephone or a telegraph or a newspaper.
Okay, and what's next in this? The court is expected to make a decision in a few months?
That's right. So they're expected to make a decision this year. And there are a number of paths they could take. They could rule entirely that the laws are unconstitutional. They could rule to uphold the laws. They could also send some of the questions back to lower courts. And ultimately, the big picture question that they are grappling with is what are these internet platforms? Are they like a newspaper, which has wide editorial discretion, or are they like a telephone wire, which you can't have censorship of certain material over the telephones or the telegraph?
Okay, David McCabe with the New York Times. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
First Warning.